You'll all get a little pop-up saying, is it okay we're recording? And you'll just say okay to that. So thank you to everyone for coming, and for the Hearthstone for bringing me along so I can facilitate this program that Susana has done 100% of the work on. But I am recording it so everybody can watch it later. So thank you, everybody. Speaking of Susana, she has been at the Coves since 2005. She was among the very first to move in. At that point, she was still working. She taught her last translation class in her apartment in person back then. Remember when we did things in person? She was a court interpreter for some 40 years. And before that, that was a second career. Before that, she taught Spanish and literature. And so an interpreter tries to blend in and disappear by nature and profession. She doesn't end up talking much about herself. At the Hearthstone Speakers Bureau, we're begging her to change that. So thank you, Susana, and take it away, please.
Thank you. So I'm going to give a little bit of information about my general background, and then I'll explain what this profession entails, what it is that court interpreters do, and how to do it. I even have a little exercise for you to do yourself so that you can taste what it is like. And then if there is time, I'll talk a little bit about other work that I did in establishing this profession, which didn't exist before, really. And of course, there'll be time for questions. So I was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina. My parents were Hungarian immigrants, so the language of the home was Hungarian, and that was the first language that I spoke. But my parents also spoke German, only among themselves when they didn't want me to understand, so they didn't teach me German. And my father knew French. He had lived in France, so he taught me some French. And then in high school, I had French and Latin. And then in college, I had 5 years of Latin, 5 years of ancient Greek, which was requirements for my career. And I was a graduate of the University of Buenos Aires as a high school teacher in Spanish and literature. So I did all that training, and then I started teaching pretty early, even before I was totally graduated, and taught for several years in Argentina. Until 1964, when I came to graduate school at the University of Washington, the Department of the Romance Languages Department in Spanish, to continue with my training. And eventually I ended up staying here in Washington State, in Seattle in particular. And I taught at several different locations, community colleges, and at the University of Washington. And one day, there was a surprise call to the department. The federal court needed an interpreter. So they thought, who speaks Spanish? Oh, Department of Spanish at the University of Washington. So they called and said, we need an interpreter. So the professor who answered the call asked me if I was interested. Oh, yeah, how interesting, court, what is that? All right, so there I went. And I had no idea what I was supposed to do. Although, as an immigrant's daughter or child, I had helped out people, recent immigrants from Hungary, who needed to do some official thing. Not for my parents. My parents spoke Spanish, but some people who just arrived in Buenos Aires and they needed to do something important. I went to help them out with the language, but I didn't consider that interpreting. I didn't know what this was. I was just helping with the language. So I did my best. I spoke very good Hungarian and very good Spanish, so that was it. But here was this thing called court. And the issue, the matter at hand was this was at the beginning of the drug importation, let's call it that. And here was this Mexican gentleman who was accused of trying to introduce 7 tons of marijuana. Not by himself, there were others who worked with him, but that was the charge. And when I arrived there in court, there were sacks of marijuana, green sacks of marijuana in the courtroom, in the well of the courtroom, so that the jury was able to appreciate what they were talking about. Of course, as I said, I didn't know what I was supposed to do. The man spoke absolutely no English, but I thought that, well, once in a while I would tell him what they were talking about. And that's what I did. Once in a while, I told him. I didn't understand myself half the things that the judge was mumbling. It was totally a language I totally ignored. I didn't know any of those words. I didn't understand what he was saying. So I didn't do a very good job as an interpreter for him. Not that it would have helped if I had been an excellent interpreter. He was convicted, of course, and sent to McNeil Island, which is where federal inmates used to be kept. And I had to accompany the attorney several times to visit him at McNeil Island, which was in itself very interesting. So that was my introduction to court interpreting. But it was very interesting to me. I had never known, that world existed. And so I started looking around. How can I learn to do this better than what I had done? And there wasn't much to many places to go. So I want to stop here about that and talk a little bit about what this is. So what is translation? What is interpretation? Because I'm saying interpreting and interpretation. Most people say translators. Oh, get me a translator, which is probably what the person from federal court told the professor, that he needed a translator, not an interpreter. So what's the difference? Do I have Al? No, he's gone. All right. Is it translation or is it interpreter? And I know Bob Hunter knows the answer to that, but translation is in writing from one document to another document. Oh, there it is. From one document to another document, all in writing. Interpretation is oral. And for that, we need three people who are participating. It's the sender of the message who says something, blah, blah, blah. And there at the other end is the receptor. But the interpreter is the tool by which these two entities communicate. The interpreter, although present, not necessarily physical, it could be by phone or by video these days, the interpreter is not a participant in the dialogue. The dialogue belongs to the sender and the receptor. The interpreter is merely the communicator. And then there is a third mode, a hybrid mode, which is sight translation. I will talk about that a little bit later on. So even today, after so many years of the need and the practice of interpretation, very often people still say translation when they mean interpretation. But oh well. So how did this need in federal court happen? Well, the US Constitution actually guarantees to all litigants equal access to the courts, regardless of what language they speak. For example, and that means not for example, that means equal access means a linguistic presence, that they are able to hear everything that is being said in their case. And they have the right to confrontation. In other words, that they are able to respond. Well, how are they going to do that if they don't speak English? English is the language of the court. If they don't understand English, how can they understand what they are saying about their case? Or how can they respond or ask questions if they don't speak the language? And that's how the need for interpreters happened in courts. The need for court interpreters actually started at the Nuremberg trials after the war. In 1945 was the first time that interpreters were used and that they practiced what is called simultaneous interpretation, interpreting at the same time as the speaker is speaking. That was the first time that that happened. So for a long time in the US, the great need for interpreters became very obvious towards the end of the Vietnam War, when there were so many immigrants, refugees coming to the States. And Washington State in particular received many. And of course, you know, they didn't speak English. And so, and many ended up in courts for different reasons, not necessarily for crimes, but you know, the courts have a lot of activities that are of a civil nature. For example, disputes about housing, for example, or parents and children, et cetera, et cetera. And Betty knows a lot about this. I never interpreted for Betty at juvenile court, but I know that she probably worked for lots of interpreters. So in 1978, the US established the Interpreter Certification Act, 1978. And if 1 year later, a federal court interpreter certification was established. And that was really the beginning of this profession of court interpreting. People knew about interpreting before that, of course, for years and years, and that was conference interpreting. If you've ever been to, for example, the UN, you probably saw and heard maybe interpretation. That interpretation was the only one known in our countries. And the interpreters are secluded in cabins in the back of the room, and they hear the speaker through headphones, and they interpret into a microphone, and the listeners are sitting in the room far away from the interpreters, listening through headphones themselves. Well, that is very different from court interpreting, where the interpreter is sitting in the middle of things and interpreting right there where the things are happening. So federal court certification was established for Spanish only at that time. And that was for all federal courts in the US. And it took until 1986 for the Washington State Supreme Court to establish minimum qualifications and standards of conduct. And a few years later, the Supreme Court added training for candidates to certifications. Washington State was at the forefront of certification and training for interpreters. They also started first with Spanish and then added 8 languages, and now there are even more. So it was a hot thing to do. I want to talk a little bit about interpreters' code of conduct, because first of all, interpreters have to speak 2 languages, right? But it's not just to speak 2 languages. It's like if somebody said, oh, you have 2 hands. Oh, you can be a pianist. Well, yes and no. It takes a little bit more than just that. And so with interpretation or translation, but mainly for interpretation, it's yes, you have to know 2 languages, and we'll talk a little bit about what that entails. But also you have to do it in a certain way. The interpreter must interpret thoroughly and precisely. I'm reading from the Code of Conduct. Conveying meaning, intent. I lost out. Okay, conveying meaning, intent.
I'm sorry, I'm here. Do you want me to put the slide up?
Number 4, please.
Yes.
So conveying the meaning and the intent there. No.
Is that the wrong one?
No, that's number 5, the previous one.
Sorry, stand by.
The next one.
Code. Okay, sorry.
There we go.
Is it up?
Yes.
Okay, so, sorry everybody.
Yeah, so interpret thoroughly, meaning everything, right? And precisely, exactly the same. That means that if a person is speaking and humming and said, and that is also part of the interpretation, because it could mean that the person is lying, that the person is not quite aware of what is happening there precisely, right? Conveying the meaning and the intent of what is being said, because sometimes we use a word with the same meaning, but with a different intent. The language level and style. Is it slang? Is it highfalutin legal language? Adding or omitting nothing. As I said, even if it is just hums and haws. Then the interpreter must remain, everything that is interpreted by the interpreter must remain confidential, never disclose it to anyone, never, unless ordered by a judge, and be neutral. So you cannot interpret for a friend, for a family member, for an acquaintance, because that could give the appearance of some bias. And this is these are some of the tenets. There are more. And the interpreters may and have lost certification for non-compliance for the code of conduct. It's very important. And through all of this, the interpreter must remain unobtrusive. The best compliment anybody can give an interpreter is to say, oh, I forgot that we have an interpreter. It means that the interpreter has done her job, but in such a way that it was seamless, that it was totally as if there had been no interpreter. That's the best that they can do. And so when an interpreter interprets the way that we described here, the interpreter doesn't care what the person is saying. For example, the witness may be lying, and it may be very obvious to the interpreter that what she's interpreting is a lie. But it doesn't matter. If there were no interpreter, if the person had been speaking English, it would be the same. Everybody would hear what the speaker wants to convey, lie or truth. It doesn't matter to the interpreter. All right. So now if we could have the next slide, please. And we talk about what an interpreter needs to do this. Well, as I said before, the interpreter needs to know 2 languages very, very well, but also excellent memory. There are so many words in all languages and so many variants, and all of this needs to be remembered at all times. When you're interpreting, you have to make decisions in a split second. There is no time to think. So it has to be just automatic, you know, to understand and to deliver the equivalent. So excellent memory, excellent concentration. You have to remember everything that a person is saying, and we'll talk about how to do that and when. You have to have clear pronunciation so that everybody can hear you and understand what you're saying. And you have to have an above average knowledge of the 2 languages. above average because it involves so many different aspects of language, of both languages. Legal terminology in both languages, and the legal systems in different countries are different from each other. So in Latin America, the legal system is, for the most part, the Napoleonic system. And here it's different. So you have to learn different systems and different terminology. Technical language, why? Because very often there are expert witnesses that appear in court and that you have to interpret for. For example, firearms, of vehicle parts, of medical, drugs, education, psychology, anything, uh, any kind of expert witness might appear, and you have to interpret for the non-English speaker. It's important to be able to learn this vocabulary if you don't know it beforehand. So interpreters usually ask attorneys for a report by the expert witness that will appear so that they can study up on the vocabulary. And then how to behave in court. It's a frightening place in court because everything is orchestrated. Everything has to be this way and not any other. So how to dress? How does an interpreter dress? Especially women interpreters have to be aware not to dress in a way that will call attention to themselves. So careful with the jewelry they wear, the colors, etc., etc. It's a little bit easier for men, but also they have to be careful of what kind of suits they wear or ties. They don't want to wear a tie that's very, bright colors or something like that, because we want to be unobtrusive. So we don't want the jury to be concentrating on the interpreter instead of on the witnesses or the attorneys. And then where to stand and sit, that's also predetermined. It's not just anywhere. The interpreter will sit by the non-English speaker. And if there is an attorney, most of the time there is, but if there is an attorney, then the interpreter doesn't sit between the non-English speaker and the attorney, but to one side of the non-English speaker. In other words, the non-English speaker sits in the middle, or the interpreter can sit in the middle, but a little bit behind, so that what we want to achieve is that the non-English speaker and the attorney communicate as much as possible as if there were no interpreter, that they look at each other rather than look at or through the interpreter. And of course, that they abide by the professional code of conduct. Let's see. Oh, about the language, another thing that I wanted to mention, that on top of knowing both languages at all levels, from slang through the higher levels of language, one other area, interesting area, is that when immigrants come to this country, for example, and they work doing things that they had never done in their country of origin, they learn new words. For example, shingles. Many work in construction. Many Spanish speakers work in construction, as you probably know. And they learn these new words, shingles, okay? They don't know how to say shingles in Spanish, and they don't care because they are here and they need to use these words. And so if somebody asks them, so what do you do? Oh, and they say in Spanish, I am a shingolero, which is an invented word that has shingle, but with the ending that says I work at shingles. So there are lots of words like this. And if you don't know as the interpreter, because that's an invented word, then what do? You have no idea what the person is saying. And there are lots of words like that. And you need to know these words too, so that you can render the message appropriately. Lots of funny stories about that. And some sad stories too. And one of those stories is about one trial I was at, a very sad case of a man who was a child abuser and a horrible person, really horrible person. And he went to trial, and he refused to have an attorney. So he represented himself. To tell the truth, he worked very hard at this. He prepared, he read all the documents, he could read English, and he could speak some English, but not perfectly. So he read all the pertinent documents and he was well informed. But in Spanish, he didn't know the legal vocabulary. So during the trial, he would use made up language, made up words in Spanish and in English. And the interpreters, we worked in pairs, we had to figure out what the heck he was saying so that we could interpret for the court. It was an interesting exercise. It was very sad. Also, one sad aspect was that one of his victims, the daughter of the woman that this man was living with, had to come to testify. And when the day came when she had to come testify in court, he was so scared that he almost committed suicide on her way to court. That was just terribly, terribly sad. Anyway, as I said before, the interpreter in court is sitting right in the fray of things, in the middle of things. And there are some unpleasant things that happen. So now we could move to the last, next one, modes of interpreting. There are 3 modes of interpreting, thank you. Simultaneous interpretation, or SIMO we call it. And this is interpreting at the same time as the speaker is speaking. This is what conference interpreters, those at the UN that we talked about before, do all the time, simultaneous. and it is almost at the same time. The reason why it's not exactly at the same time is because you have to hear something, understand it, and then interpret it. So the interpretation comes with a short lag behind the speaker and per unit of meaning. And a unit of meaning is those words that kind of hang together to make sense. So for example, if I say, sometimes, well, that has some meaning, but sometimes what? What would I interpret? I don't know what follows. Or it doesn't matter how many words are in a unit. They just have to make sense. If I say, well, depending on the intent, right? If the speaker says, I say, well, that's not a unit of meaning. I can't interpret very much. But if I change the tone, if I say, well, that has a meaning in itself, right? It's an idiom. So, we are short lag behind the speaker, and it is whispering because an interpreter is speaking at the same time as the speaker. So you don't want to interfere. The speaker needs to be heard. The interpreter needs to be heard only by one person. So there is special equipment. We were lucky at King County that we had the court bought the special equipment. So we could speak into a transmitter and the litigant would listen through headphones, or otherwise the interpreter needs to lean over into the litigant's ear and interpret that way. Very unpleasant. People who spend time in jail do not smell very good. So it's very unpleasant to have to do that. So the simultaneous would be done when the judge speaks or when attorneys give a presentation. In other words, or when there is a witness on the stand. In other words, there is no dialogue with the non-speaker. The consecutive mode is where there is a dialogue with where did we go? Hello. When there is a dialogue with the non-English speaker, and that happens when the attorney talks to his or her client, or when the non-English speaker is testifying. And in order to interpret this, then the speaker speaks, the interpreter listens to the utterance and then interprets. And some people speak very nicely. They say a sentence, for example, and they stop for the interpreter to interpret. Other people just want to get it out, all of it, and they don't want to stop. Well, it's not possible to remember all of that. Some interpreters take notes, but still sometimes the interpreter needs to request for the witness to stop at intervals so that she can interpret. Of course, the interpreter cannot tell the speaker, stop, speak slowly. The interpreter has to ask the judge for permission to ask that. Everything has to be allowed by the judge. And the consecutive, as opposed to the simultaneous mode, is out loud for everybody to hear. And it's very important because in court, there is the record, which is really the interpreter's boss. Everything is done for the record. So you have to be careful what goes into the record, because that's how things will be reviewed. And the third mode is the hybrid mode we talked about before, the side translation. And it is hybrid because it originates in a document. There is a document that needs to be read in the other language. In other words, interpreted orally, right? Out loud, right there, then and there. And it is pretty hard because many of these documents are legal, and you haven't seen them before, or they've seen it before. Others are handwritten by somebody who didn't learn how to write very well. So you have to figure out what they were trying to say, and there are lots of mistakes, spelling mistakes, and no punctuation at all, etc., etc. And you have to figure it out right then and there. So those are the three modes. Let's see. Well, let's see, what time is it? Are you up to do a little bit of an exercise in simultaneous interpretation? Or what do you say? No, not simultaneous interpretation, but it would be what we call shadowing. And it's shadowing because you will be repeating what I'm saying, okay? But the trick, repeating, how easy, parrot. I know, but you have to do it per unit of meaning. So when you hear a unit of meaning, then you can repeat that. But at the same time, you're still listening for the second unit of meaning. And when you're done with the first unit of meaning, you can then repeat the second unit of meaning, etc., etc. So you're doing two things at the same time. You're listening for a unit of meaning and also repeating the previous unit of meaning. Make sense?
I want to mention that everybody who wants to play should unmute themselves. I do not have the power to unmute you.
Yeah, but okay. Are you ready? So, and you have to, you cannot do it in your head. You have to actually say it. Repeat those units of meaning, okay? Here we go. This being America, it was probably inevitable that we would turn the scientific breakthrough of a pandemic-ending vaccine into a game show. It's like, who wants to be a millionaire with cash prizes, or The Price is Right, where you can come on down to get a jab and a chance at an Xbox, or free flights to Cancun, or gift cards redeemable for topsoil. Yes, really, topsoil. Whatever works. It's a little strange, though, that there's not more hoopla around what's happening with the vaccines themselves.
Okay.
Yes?
Would you repeat that?
I think we all dropped out in about a half a sentence.
It is the hardest mode of interpretation to learn, because it's not natural. we were always taught, don't speak when somebody else is speaking, right? That's the first thing. But then, you know, you have to hear and come up with something while you're at the same time listening to the next thing. So it is very, very demanding, very, very demanding. Once you learn it, then it's the easiest thing to do because you don't have to remember more than one unit of meaning. While on the other hand, with the consecutive interpretation, you have to remember several sentences that the person is saying, sometimes with a strange diction or, you know, or using words that, you know, dialect or whatever, right? So it's interesting. All right. So now could we have the videos, please? Are you there? Ah, here you are.
I am here. I need to find those videos. It'll take me a moment. So
we have 2 short videos just to show you the positioning of an interpreter doing consecutive interpretation and simultaneous interpretation. Those of you who have worked with interpreters, like Bob, like Betty, probably know more about consecutive interpretation than
so I'm sorry, which one are we doing first? Are we doing consecutive first?
Yeah, whichever you have first. But
okay, yeah. I've got it. I'm going to put it up. Let me share my screen. Just one moment, please. And I want to make sure I'm sharing my audio too, so bear with me. Okay, here we go.
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen what happened, please?
¿Puede decirle a las señoras y señores qué fue lo que sucedió, por favor?
Estábamos sentados afuera echándonos unos tragos, fumando, usted sabe, haciendo cosas que no deberíamos estar haciendo en realidad. Estábamos sentados ahí atrás comiendo plátanos y otras bobadas.
We were sitting there, we were drinking, we were smoking, we were doing things that we weren't supposed to be doing. We were sitting back there having plantains and other stuff.
Would you please be specific? Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen what you were smoking?
Entre en detalle, por favor. Dígale a las señoras y señores qué es lo que estaba fumando.
Estábamos fumando marihuana. Yo estaba fumando con unos amigos y acababa de salir del trabajo porque salí un poquito más temprano ya que yo soy capataz.
We were smoking marijuana. I was smoking with some friends. I had gotten out of work a little early because I'm the foreman.
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen what happened from that point forward?
Dígale, por favor, a las señoras y señores qué fue lo que sucedió a partir de ese momento.
Bueno, estábamos sentados ahí reunidos, conversando, usted sabe, simplemente pasándolo como la gente común y corriente hace todos los días.
Well, we were there, we were sitting, gathered together, chatting the way people do normally.
Bueno, y yo estaba fumando marihuana.
Well, and I was smoking marijuana.
Okay. So you see that the witness is looking at the interpreter all the time, right? But the interpreter doesn't look at him, right? Because the interpreter is trying to establish the communication between the witness and the attorney, not with the interpreter. And she's taking notes because he talks quite a bit and he's gesticulating, but the interpreter never repeats any gestures, right? The interpreter just deals with words, that's all, right? Yeah. And now we can see the Simo, please.
I'm not totally clear on that. Is this the 2 interpreters test their interpreting skills? Or is that different?
No, yeah, it's different.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Doesn't matter.
No, we can get there. Sorry, guys. So Not the consecutive, but the simultaneous. All right, let me find that. Stand by.
Okay. All right. Well, do you have any questions about this in particular? Well,
I did mute people, so if people are talking, you're going to have to unmute yourselves.
okay. So let's see. One important issue with the self-effacing interpreters, they don't want to be on the spot, right? But
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen?
Will they ever make a mistake? Ha! It's not if they will make a mistake. Interpreters will make mistakes. There's no doubt about it. The issue is how to recover from a mistake. Right? So sometimes what happens is that you make a mistake and you don't realize that you made a mistake until the next morning. Oh my goodness, I said that he had eaten an apple instead of a pear. Oh no, my goodness. So when you go back to court, you have to say, Your Honor, the interpreter made a mistake yesterday. The interpreter said he ate an apple instead of a pear. Okay, you have to own up. Sometimes there are attorneys who speak the language or think they speak the language well enough, and they will say that the interpreter made a mistake. And if it's true, if you realize that indeed you made a mistake, you say, the interpreter apologizes, that is correct, the interpreter made a mistake, it should have been this instead, it should have been a pear and not an apple. But if you are sure that you did not make a mistake, you can look it up in the dictionary, then the interpreter will say, the interpreter stands by her interpretation, right? And goodbye. And as you notice, the interpreter speaks in the third person. Remember, the interpreter is not the participant. The interpreter is not an I ever. The interpreter is a third person, the interpreter. All right.
You ready?
Okay. Yeah, I think well, maybe, not sure.
Just yell stop if it's not the right one. Sorry.
No, I don't think
it's important
because this is
court
explains
record is in English in the United States.
Okay.
And
well, let's skip that.
Is this good?
No.
All right, I'll get rid of it.
Okay. So let's see. I made my share of mistakes as an interpreter, starting with that very first trial that I had no idea what to do with. But even afterwards, and they stick in my mind, you're like, they are on fire still. One time, I think it was an immigration detention. There was a woman there who had been in a car coming up to Washington State illegally or without documentation, as the softer description is. And she had her daughter with her. And the police stopped the car and took her into detention by herself without her daughter. And so the attorney, we went to talk to her with the attorney, And the woman was sobbing, sobbing, uncontrollably, throwing, where's my daughter? Where's my daughter? When can I see my daughter? It was just terrible. And we couldn't speak. The attorney couldn't say a word because she was crying so hard. And I reached out, just automatically, I reached out to touch her because I was so, so sad. And I grabbed her arm and just squeezed her arm. And to this day, I can still feel that. It was so wrong because an interpreter is not supposed to show any feelings of any sort. And here I was commiserating, you know, I can still feel that. Oh, it was just terrible, terrible. What other stories?
I think I've got it now. You want me to play it?
Okay.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything that you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Do you understand that?
Sí.
Yes.
You also have the right to counsel. If you're unable to afford counsel, this court will appoint counsel to represent you. Are you able to afford an attorney?
No.
No.
Do you wish me to appoint counsel to represent you?
Sí.
Yes.
And toward that end, have you filled out this financial affidavit?
Sí.
Yes.
Okay.
Can I be satisfied that the information here is true and correct?
Sí.
Yes.
Is that enough?
Raise your right hand.
Yes, good enough.
Okay.
Okay. So you saw the interpreter is in the back with headphones and with a microphone, and the defendant is in front with her attorney and listening to the interpreter, right? And this is in the simultaneous mode, but also the consecutive. When she was asked a question, the defendant replied and the interpreter interpreted in consecutive mode. So in some courts, the interpreters sitting apart at a different table, in some other courts sitting next to, but it's simultaneous any which way. Well, I do have to tell you the story of the astronaut because there was a little man who lived in his car, not far from the county courthouse in downtown Seattle. And every so often, the police would visit him, first of all, because he was, sleeping in his car in downtown Seattle, but also because they usually found a little bit of cocaine in his car. And so he was arrested and he went to court time and time again. Oh, but no, I didn't do anything. It was always his story. No, it's because the virgins tell me what to do. The virgins? Yes, yeah, the 3 virgins. When I fly my car in the clouds, the 3 virgins appear and they tell me what to do. Or they come and sit by my bedside and they tell me what to do. Well, this is the story he always told in court. And I still remember, there was this judge, C.V. Johnson, who was a wonderful person. He died a few months ago. And he was a big, big man. And sometimes he was standing when he was listening to this story. Other times he was sitting and he would look over his glasses at me like I was crazy telling this story. And yeah, of course, it wasn't my story. And then there was another judge who outside of court, one time we were talking about the astronaut, and he says, I'm afraid of driving my car because I don't want to run into this flying car that might hit me. Anyway, the poor thing, there was a prosecutor who offered him a very good deal to plead guilty. Otherwise, he would have to go to jail, for a long, long time. And the attorney, the defense attorney, asked the prosecutor to please talk to him. The prosecutor spoke Spanish. This was his last case in Superior Court. And so we had a session, and the prosecutor was begging for him to please plead guilty so that he wouldn't have to go to jail for many years. And the guy said, no, I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. Okay, he didn't plead guilty, and he went away for a long time. But it was the prosecutor's last case. Now he's a federal judge. But anyway, so what else? Well, do you have any questions? Because it's 3 o'clock already. So if you have any questions, I can ask, or I can tell some more stories, or I can tell you what else I did.
Susana?
Yes.
This is Bob Hunter. I have a question. How do the court recorders handle this? Do they just record what the interpreter is saying? Or is there any attempt to write down the foreign language testimony?
You mean the reporter?
Yeah, the reporter.
Right. Yes, it takes down what the interpreter says. And
okay.
That's the record. That's why it's so important to be very, very accurate, because so that's what, but many courts now record the proceedings, and then both languages are there, which is much better, because if there is any question about the interpretation, they can go and listen.
Right.
So that's better. Yes.
I hope you were paid extraordinarily well.
I'm sorry?
I hope you were paid extraordinarily well.
Yes, well, yeah, federal court always pays much better than a state court. Yes, Alice.
Tell us the time, if there ever was one, when you were stumped.
Oh, well, when you're in trial, usually interpreters work in a team, and so they help each other. So not only do you have to process what's being said, but also you take notes, or you pay attention in case your teammate needs your help, right? Because you can hear what your team member is saying, and so you can hear when the person hesitates, and you know why, no? So you know. Well, if an interpreter gets stumped, then there are two options. You say, Your Honor, the interpreter asks for permission to consult the dictionary, or consult her team member. And you do, you know. But it's very humbling to have to do that. But that's the way it goes. Yeah.
Susana?
Yes.
I'd like to go back to your early life. I'm intrigued by the requirement of 5 years of ancient Greek. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Yes, and what was the thinking behind that?
Well,
classical languages.
It didn't sound so logical at the time, but it has its logic. When you study literatures of the Western world, and you start from the beginning, you need to know, you need to be able to understand those, at least in part, those languages and the culture, because that's when everything started. Okay. And so that's the thing. Yeah. Yeah, it's European kind of thinking. Okay. But I was glad. I'm just sorry that I've forgotten all my Latin after so many years. Well, I can tell you a little bit about, is it okay, Ella?
Yes, yes, you've got all the time. You've got all the time.
Okay. Tell you a little bit about what happened after that ill-fated first trial, when I started to get interested in interpreting. I continued to teach Spanish language and literature, but was looking at places to get trained as an interpreter. I had always been trained and then practiced what I had trained in. And here I was doing something before I got training. Well, that didn't sound right. And so I found this place, which wasn't hidden, but I just had to find it, University of Arizona, that had an interpreter institute, and still does. And they offered a 3-week training program every summer, July in Tucson, every summer. So I went and I learned a lot. I learned a lot and learned what I didn't know, which was also a lot. And so that's how I started. And then some years later, I went back to teach there, and I taught there for 21 years, 3 weeks every summer in Tucson.
Hot.
Yeah. I also taught at an interpreting program at Charleston College in Charleston, South Carolina, in June, which was very hot and humid, but also wonderful. And I taught there, I think, for 4 years also. So I used to go to Charleston in June and to Tucson in July. Right. Love them all.
Wow.
And then when certification, when they started talking about interpreting in Washington State, I was very involved in establishing the certification program. There was a task force by the Supreme Court, Washington Supreme Court, and I was representing interpreters there. And then I got certified in the first batch of, well, I had been certified, federally certified in 1986, I think, became federally certified. And then when the first certification, I think in '89 for Washington State, and then when they established the training program, I developed the program and developed the materials for training for Spanish interpreters at first, and then the other languages. And I even taught one Cambodian. I don't speak Cambodian, but I was helping a Cambodian interpreter because he didn't know much about training. He only knew the language. So we worked as a team. And those programs are still in place right now with training and continuing education. And also I was involved in founding a Translation and Interpretation Institute. Some of you have heard this, with a friend, a translator friend, and that eventually we took to Bellevue College. And that's all, that program is still active right now. Also was part of groups that founded professional associations. There were two in the beginning, one for translators and one for interpreters, Notice and WITS, Northwest Translators and Interpreters Society, and Washington State Interpreters Society, which merged at one point, and now there's only one, but still existing. So I was very active and still working, of course. And I became a staff interpreter in King County Superior Court and the assistant manager of the Office of Interpreter Services. And that was fascinating because I got to look for interpreters in languages I had never heard existed. I don't know if you know that Tukwila is the second city in the United States with the number of foreign languages spoken in the home, 160 different languages. It's incredible. And languages, you know, you never heard of. And all of a sudden, there was somebody who needed an interpreter in court. They didn't speak a word of English. And so we had to look for interpreters. And so one of my pet stories is one time we had a person who needed an interpreter in a language from India. There was nobody in this area. I don't remember what language it was, but there was nobody in this area that could do it. So I contacted a colleague in Vancouver, BC, and I asked if she knew of somebody. And she said, oh, yes, we have somebody that could go over there. Oh, great. But the little problem was that this person had to cross the border, enter the US, not as a tourist. He was coming to work and get paid for it. Uh-oh. So that's not good news for the border agents. So I had to get a presiding judge in King County Superior Court to write a letter to a border agent explaining the need of the court and what was going to happen. And so I developed quite a relationship over the phone with Agent Baca at the border, who explained exactly how this was going to work. And he, in person, was going to wait for this man to cross the border so that, you know, there would be no problem in him entering without, you know, saying, because they always ask you, what are you going to do in this country? And so he had to explain what to do, and there was a letter. So it was really interesting, especially for me, because being an immigrant, although I came legally with documentation, even to this day, I shudder when it has to do with immigration, something to do with immigration. And so to have this relationship over the phone with the agent was quite something for me, but it was very educational. Let's see. Oh, the other interesting one was one time we had a person, a Native American from one of the Dakotas who spoke Lakota, the language, indigenous language, and he needed an interpreter. Well, I think he was the only Dakotan here in Seattle, so there were no Lakota interpreters here. So I had to get in touch with the tribe member, in an elder in wherever it was, I forget the city, and they found a Lakota interpreter. So it was over the phone because the litigant was here, the interpreter was over there. And of course, usually these kind of interpreters are not interpreters really, they are just speakers of the language. So I had to supervise what they were doing because they had to act as interpreters, you know, with all the requirements of what an interpreter does, being neutral, being one of the important ones. So I always had to play this role of making sure that people behaved. So that was interesting too. What other story can I tell you? Well, there was this is when I first started. For some reason, the Red Cross got my name somehow and used to call me to interpret in hospitals. I always hated the smell of hospitals. If I saw a little bit of blood, I'd instantly faint, but literally faint. Whenever I had to get a blood sample taken, I would warn the doctor, I'm very likely to faint. Just letting you know, oh, yeah. Well, I did faint. Yeah. So one time, the Red Cross called me and sent me to Harborview, emergency. Okay, so I go in and there's this man on a gurney and he's bleeding all over the place. Okay, well, not a good beginning for me. And they're the doctors, and their doctors are discussing what they are going to do with him. He had some kind of, you know, an open belly or something. And so they were discussing what to do. And the patient said, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. Because I was interpreting what the doctors were saying, right? No, that's not what they want. This is what you need to do. I know because I went to medical school in Cuba. Okay, so he didn't say he was a doctor. He went to medical school. And so he's bleeding and bleeding. Okay, and the doctors keep talking among themselves. And so then all of a sudden, another doctor comes in and he says, it's noon, I'm going to go get lunch. What do you want to eat? I can bring it. and I'm trying to hold it in. I'm trying not to faint. Well, so sometime later, this same man appeared in court, and he appeared quite a few times in court. He always complained because nobody paid attention that he had been wounded. Yes, I remember that. And he, at some point, he had a colostomy bag attached to his body, when he came to court, and he threatened with, they weren't listening to him, so he threatened with dropping it on the floor and let it all flow out. But it was always an issue of drugs that he had in his possession, or he was using. He was Cuban, and he spoke Cuban too. Cuban is quite distinct, and when people weren't being, when the judge in particular wasn't quite listening, in his opinion, to what he was saying, he always lifted his shirt and showed the scar that he had from that time when he had been attacked, and nobody believed him. Well, and so years later, as I say, he appeared very often. He was in a trial for the same thing, and carrying a weapon. And all of a sudden, one day, I was in my office and interpreter services, and the phone rings and asking for me. There's a man, and he said that he was this person's brother. He lives in Paris, and so the defendant had given him my phone number in the office, and the brother was a poet there. And so he asked me to give to his brother this poem that he had written for him. And so he dictated the poem, which was a pretty good poem, to me. And I wrote it down and then gave it to Leonel, who was in jail, of course. That was another interesting thing. Many interesting stories. Another one, another funny one, kind of funny. I had been interpreting for a man, I think it was an immigration case. And his wife had come from the East Coast for this hearing. And then, the case was over, but she asked me for my phone number just in case. And I gave it to her, which I shouldn't have done. But the case was over, so I gave it to her because she had to go back east. So then she called, one day she called and she told me that she needed my help because her husband was being released. And he was being released from detention in a paper suit because they couldn't find his clothes. So that's what they do when they release someone. They give them a paper suit. And she was buying him a ticket to go back by plane and also sending him some money. Could I please pick him up, take him to collect the money and to take him to the airport? Oh, well, all right. Well, so I said I would. And I said, but, thought to myself, I'm not going to go by myself to do these errands. So I asked a friend of mine if she could go with me to do this. And so she said, yes. And it turns out that her husband had some clothes that he was going to give to Goodwill. So we took some of those clothes for this man. And so we went, did the errands, got the ticket, got some money, went to the airport. But indeed, when I arrived at the detention center, he was standing in the doorway in a paper suit, just like that. So then we took him to the airport. He changed and he called his wife and he was on his way. That was, yeah, some funny things. One thing my children enjoyed immensely was if somebody asked, where's your mother? In jail, they said. They love to do that. Yes, I spent quite some time in jail. Any questions?
I had to step out for a moment. Can I ask a question, even though I'm the Zoom dude? I had to step out for a minute, so I apologize if you've already covered this. But I was reading, and I don't remember which article it was, but it was about court interpreting and how it doesn't happen all the time, but every once in a while, an attorney will get really up in arms about how much better his Spanish is than yours, or his Bulgarian is than yours, or something, and there'll be an argument back and forth. Was that an issue ever in your career?
Oh yes, yeah, I did cover it, and so you say if it's true, if it was a mistake, then you acknowledge that and say the interpreter apologizes. She should have said that, but if it's not that way, then the interpreter stands by her interpretation. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it happens.
Big deal.
Yeah. And, you know, it happens to everybody. It happens to attorneys. It happens to judges, too, that somebody calls them on the carpet. As long as it's respectful, it's okay. And interpreters make mistakes. There's no question about it. As I said before, yeah, they will make mistakes. There's no perfect interpreter. Yeah, it's very stressful. Yeah. Any other questions?
I just want to say thank you, Susana, for, this is Claire, for telling your story. So telling it and then telling it so well and in such interesting detail.
Yeah.
It's fun to see who you are and not just calling you for reserving a part. Now I know who you are.
Yeah, it was really a thrilling. It was really a thrilling time. Interpreting was, and as I was telling Alan that you know, my mind was always working while I was an interpreter, continuously, and now, poor thing.
I know what you mean.
Nothing, pure mush.
Not true. Not true. I want to say thank you. Thank you. You obviously loved what you did, which you know makes what I mean. It's you could tell from the way you told the story, and you know you make it so I love what I'm doing. Like this is wonderful. It really is. Just it's so wonderful to us now and viewers of the future on Channel 370. You've given a great gift. So thank you so much.
And thank you all for coming.
We enjoyed it immensely.
Okay.
Thank you, Susana.
All right.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.